Welcome to Legacy Conversations, a channel where we preserve military memories and history.
Greetings, folk. Dag sê. Thank you for joining me here for a very quick one. Koos and Rebecca have graciously invited me to leave you a link, wherever we put the link to my Buy Me a Coffee page. Yes, please, if you're happy with the edit of this, or if I occasionally host a video, I'd appreciate your feedback, and or you buying me a coffee, a beer, a glass of wine, or even maybe a small whiskey. But I'm going to categorically state, for the Legacy Conversations where this gets used, all that money is going to be reserved for a very special project, of which you will hear all about soon. So thank you very much. I do appreciate your contributions. Thank you, Donkey. Bye.
Hello Internet, I'm excited. This is the second episode. We're talking to Major General Koos Bom Lobsher, as well as Colonel Pierre Franken, whose name I abused last week. I do apologize, sir. It was not on purpose. Hello everyone, just a short announcement, won't take much of your time. People have been asking me, how can you assist the channel? You know, we've been going on now almost 4 years. We've recorded almost 1,000 videos, and we were fairly successful. We are close to 4 million views, and we are very close to 1 million hours of being watched. So we've done a lot to boost the image of the SADF and the SAP, and we will carry on doing it for as long as possible. But we do need help. We do need you to support us in any way you can. Spread the word, make good comments, give it a thumbs up. And also, if you wish, join the Patreons. That's for $5 a month. Of course, if you want to make it $20 or $50, you're more than welcome. There's about 50 of you who's doing that right now, out of 100,000 a month who come here to look at the videos. And that really assists us, because that, in the first place, makes us feel good. And secondly, it pays for our Zoom. And we can also use the money if we go on a field trip or if we need new equipment. That's the one way. The other way is you can support us by buying my books, the books I wrote, or the George M. James books, which are all very good books, and it's books which you would be interested in. If you like Legacy, you're going to like those books. So we created a brand new channel on YouTube where we discuss only the books, and thus we're leaving the Legacy channel alone just to do the military stuff and police stuff and tell stories. I will leave the links for Patreon as well as the new YouTube channel. I'll leave it in for you in the description. Thank you. Let's get back to the video. And this is very fascinating, which we're going to speak about today. And there's going to be a third episode as well. And if you want to know who these guests are, these gentlemen, please go to the first video. You'll find out about them and the artillery corps in the South African Army, and you will find out they know what they're talking about. But today, I believe we want to talk about Dr. Gerald Bull. He was a Canadian, I believe, and he was somehow involved in the G5, but the gentleman will tell us about him. We'll also talk about the G6, which is a mobile self-propelled gun, I suppose, mounted. The G5 155mm is on it. And then we're going to speak about logistics, because for me, the beginning and the end of any campaign is logistics. These guns don't fire by themselves. They need the shells. They need everything there to be able to work. But if we talk about other things as well, I'll be most grateful too. It doesn't matter. So, General, welcome. Thank you, sir. Over to you.
Thank you, Koos, for the opportunity. Starting with the Gerald Bull story, he was a scientist, engineer, residing in Canada, where he built a gigantic gun with a very, very long barrel, so long that it had to be suspended, otherwise it would bend. And his object was to launch a series of satellites by means of this gun into outer space. So purely on account of that, one can deduce what the size of his project actually was. Then on our side, coming to the development of a replacement gun for our old British 25 pounders and the 5.5-inch guns. At that stage, early stage of the development plan, Commandant Joffel van der Westhuizen, later Colonel, and he also finally attained the rank of Lieutenant General. But as a commandant, he was assigned as the project officer, project leader for the development then of what was to replace the said old two British guns. In the work that he has done and what he could establish from what was happening on the other side of the world, in one other way, he made contact with this Dr. Bull, or vice versa. I'm not completely in the picture as to why and where these two came together. So given what Gerald Bull tried to do in Canada, it was apparently, obviously, that this person could assist us, or the team of Commandant van der Westhuizen, to obtain or build, manufacture, develop our own long-range gun. Obviously, not with the idea of launching satellites into outer space. So gradually, that vision become more of a reality, and development started to establish what we later used as or called the G5 gun, 155mm G5 gun, with all the requirements met by the team, the development team, and of course also indirectly us as the end user. Then some other nations in the Western Hemisphere, mainly, they became aware of Gerald Bull's in working with us to provide what we need at that stage. And in one way or the other, Gerald Bull also made contact with Saddam Hussein, the then leader of Iraq. And from what I could gather through the years, the Iraqis, or Saddam Hussein in person, was interested in a gun, long-range gun, with the capability of firing out of Iraq into Tel Aviv and other Israeli cities. And certain Western-orientated governments, they didn't like what was about to happen or what could happen. So they then decided to get rid of this Gerald Bull, get him out of the equation in one way or the other. And that eventually resulted in killing of this man. What is the word? Assassination. He was assassinated in the hotel in which he lived in Belgium. He was apparently, after supper, walking down the passage to his room, and while walking, he was assassinated by apparently small caliber pistols, or a small caliber pistol, and that was the end of Gerald Bull. Now, what is also interesting, what actually caught the attention of certain Western governments initially was, on a good day in the harbor of Athens, the crane was busy offloading a very large crate, wooden crate, onto the deck. Anyways, to get this down on the wharf, I think you call it a wharf. But in the process, either the crane broke or the chain broke, but this big crate fell to the ground and cracked open in many pieces. And on closer inspection, attention was drawn onto the contents, which was then identified as possible parts of a very large gun. Apparently then the gun that Saddam Hussein envisaged to use in his country. And this incident actually set the ball rolling of getting rid of Bull. So very shortly, that is what I know for what it is worth. But certain of these things we know did happen. For example, the assassination in the hotel. Okay, that's about Gerald Bull. Coming to the G6, I in person, I'm not very enthusiastic about the G6 for a couple of reasons. But we have been informed, and for everybody who reads a lot, they should have picked up that the G6 was operationally tested or proven during Operation Modular. And from that came the initiative, probably from our own armaments corporation, to make that feat known to the rest of the world and to try and sell the G6. So it became a financial venture, so to speak. But the notion that the G6 was operationally proven is incorrect, because the project leader, a guy called Van Botma, Lieutenant Colonel Botma, he told me in person that they only fired a few rounds, and then there were stoppages of one or other technical nature, and they couldn't continue fire any longer. So very limited number of shells fired, and then they withdrew back to South Africa. And from that, my remark that the claim that the G6 has been battle proven is false. I think, as I've said, some people saw in it, in what was said about the testing, the proving of the gun in Angola. They used that for probable financial adventures. Now, eventually, the G6 came into service in our artillery for training purposes. We have not used it operationally, but I also know that quite a number of G6s have actually been bought by a number of countries in the Northern Hemisphere. I'm not sure which countries are involved, but I know for sure that some of the countries in the northern desert area of the Sahara type of countries, some of them have got quite a number of G6s that they acquired from us. But unless my information is not correct, not even there in their hands have the G6 actually been proven in battle, because I don't know about battles in that part of the world, currently. So technically, the G6 will have to pass that test whenever it may happen, somewhere in future. So that is more or less what I had in mind about Gerald Bull. Of course, he was a brilliant man. To have that ambition of launching satellites into the outer space. I mean, it's not everybody's type of work. Okay, then I would like to go on about logistics, but specifically artillery-related logistics. As we encountered during our war in Angola over the period 1975 till 1988, and for a very limited time also after 1988. Remember, we only established, or the country, our country was only established in 1994. So what I have in front of me are various examples of artillery logistical aspects. Some of them I find very interesting. I think you would probably also find them very interesting. So let me share with you some examples of logistics in the artillery world. Firstly, I took my dictionary just to see what the language people determine in the word logistics. They say logistics is the science pertaining to the planning of warehousing, the planning of stockpiling, and the allotment and delivery of supplies when and where needed by the end user, and to do that in a sustainable and cost-effective manner. Then note here, stockpiling and warehousing are, as a general rule, a gambit at the strategic level and not at the end user level. Then artillery with specific mention of ammunition is, as a rule, logistically very heavy in its initial demand, but eventually often also reliant on efficient and timeous resupply in terms of numbers and type, where and when needed, as dictated by prevailing combat situation or anticipated future operational developments. And I would now like to show you something about the geographical dimensions, because what we have here is 155 millimeter ammunition planning for a specific operation, Alpha Centauri. Yes, for Operation Alpha Centauri, which happened in early August 1986. In the left upper corner, you can see the range of different projectiles available to us for the G5 and obviously also for the G6, both of them 155 millimeter caliber. From high explosive on the left, that dark green projectile with a yellow band, then the white next to it, white phosphorus. The other white one probably for distribution of propaganda pamphlets. And then there's another dark green one with the possibility of an extended range in comparison to the green one on the left. And then that light green one, that's for ejecting smoke canisters if you want to create a smoke screen for whatever the reasons. And the other three simply more examples of high explosives, which you, by using the different fuses, you could detonate them on contact with a target or at a specific height above ground level. Okay, coming back to the number of rounds, there you can see for that operation we planned on 3,230 complete rounds. Now, complete means shell, fuse, and the combustion charge. So there where you see the red sun now, division of charges, 70% on charge 3, the highest charge, and a smaller number for charge 2, and then expressed in terms of figures 2261 and 969. The similar with fuses, direct action that I've mentioned, and also proximity fuse, and 60% of the one and 40% of the other one. So it is a wide range of ammunition pieces, if I may call it like that. Then percussion tubes, that's a very small tube inserted into the back of the gun, the firing mechanism, just to ignite the charge. And then at the bottom, you can see the number, 3,230 projectiles, and so for the charges and so on. But what is important is the established value. Now, those figures are based on 2023, which is not too long ago. Let us assume a little bit of inflation since then, but this gives you an idea of what artillery ammunition could cost for one single operation. 162 tons, which worked out on 34 SAML 100 10-ton trucks. So we are looking here at a whole convoy of trucks just to move that ammunition. Here, something similar for the 127 rockets, 4,106 complete rounds. There you can see the same figure for the rockets. Then the drag rings. Now, the drag ring is as the name implies, it is a metal ring, and they come in different diameters. You can add it onto the front end of the rocket to get drag on the rocket if you want to shoot at shorter ranges than the maximum range. The wind projectile is a small, funny little thing. A couple of minutes before you would fire, you fire this little wind projectile, a number of them, and depending on where they land on the ground, you can make certain deductions about this, the strength and the direction of the wind. Factor that we always had to take into consideration in planning the data that should go to the gun or the MRL onto the site. Okay, there's also the estimated value. In this case, 700 million rand, which is a lot of money. And again, a heavy load, 362 tons, and again, 51 10-ton trucks. Here you see everything combined. Let us go to the estimated values. 194 plus 700, that gives us 894. No, sorry, that's the value. 894 million rand, a total of 85 Sobel 100 10-ton trucks, and 127 millimeter wise, also large figure, 700 million. Now, if one looks at these figures, it becomes clear that we had to do everything in our ability to make sure that every round counted on a target. Otherwise, one would have simply wasted a lot of ammunition, and by doing that, also wasting a lot of money. So accuracy of fire, accuracy of impact for us were of the utmost importance on both of these two types of launchers. The ultimate challenge for the logistics family, transporting more than 500 tons of ammunition worth almost 1 billion rand, that's in 2025 value, across an area, across a distance of 2,616 kilometers by means of trains, trucks, and aircraft to destroy 12 FOPLA, that is the defense force of the Angolans at that time, to destroy 12 of their brigades, which we, and we are very proud of that one. We achieved that in less than 40 minutes active time, not that we were firing constantly for 40 minutes, but between the first round and the last round on any one of those targets, more or less 40 minutes, which is, in our opinion, a worldwide record that will stand for a long time. In fact, the destruction of 12 FOPLA brigades technically meant that on that occasion, in less than 40 minutes, we actually destroyed, we take the heart out of the whole Angolan army. And they needed, after that, early in August 1986, they needed no less than 13 months to become active again. So again, we are very, very proud of what we have achieved there, and we also make sure we got value for every cent that was spent on all those ammunitions. Okay, coming back to logistics in a general sense, it also entails the phasing out of main equipment and associated ammunition for whatever reason, as well as certain ancillary equipment. Decisions also made at strategic level. For example, I mentioned it earlier this morning, the phasing out of the 25 pounder and the 5.5 inch as our main equipment. Then training on new types of ammunition was an SA Army responsibility and not that of the Quartermaster General and his staff. Here I would like to use an example. In my time at the Army Battle School at Luatla, we received a number of senior officers on one day, and I had to do certain demonstrations to them regarding our new artillery equipment and capabilities. Inter alia, demonstrating the M5 120mm mortar that we bought from the Israelis. Very, very, very handy and a very good piece of equipment. I must give them credit. Now, this mortar had a range of about 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 meters, depending on the height above sea level. But by unscrewing the fins at the back of the mortar bomb, you could replace that with what we called a candle. It was a mechanism, after the mortar bomb has been fired, the mechanism to ignite itself and then to give extra thrust to the motor bomb, about 10% increase in thrust, or in maximum range. Now, what happened on that day is, when I fired that first motor, everybody, of course, was looking upwards to see what's going to happen now. And then this candle ignited, and after it was burnt out, it was rejected, coming back, falling to the ground. Now, nobody explained to us, nobody taught us on that motor. I sorted out how to use that motor and this candle the Sunday evening prior to this visit. I did that in my office, on my bed, sorted out what the hell is this candle thing that I had never seen before. In any case, as that candle then came down, I thought, yeah, this thing must please not hit one of the visitors. And it struck the ground about 10, 20 meters in front of them. So there I learned the lesson of understanding that the army is responsible for training its people on new equipment, in this case, new ammunition. It's not a quartermaster general responsibility. Lesson learned. And after that, we never played around with new ammunition that we were not trained on. Then what is also important is the correct identification at depot level of ammunition as demanded by the end user. That was a quartermaster general responsibility. Now, while the reason why I've added this specific item in our presentation, I witnessed at one stage, one night in Angola, where 155 millimeter ammunition was delivered to us, that it was the wrong type of 155 millimeter ammunition. Actually, ammunition, nothing wrong with the caliber, but the problem lied with the shape and the size of the ammunition, and that was meant for the G4 gun, which we borrowed from the Israelis a couple of months prior to that. So that whole consignment of the wrong 155 millimeter ammunition delivered that night had to be transported back all the way to Grootfontein to be handed back to the people working there. So that again underscored the responsibility at all levels for the correct identification of ammunition. Then coming back to projects, it was also required from project leaders and their teams to familiarize the end user with the logistical implications that would emanate from these developments. So that went hand in hand with the development of the mine equipment as such. Familiarization is a feat that was achieved admirably. So also to regularly invite the end user to evaluate and respond. That resulted in a number of very attainable requests, and in some cases in minor modifications to some existing blueprint plans. For example, I happened to be with the project team out in the field, and the item on that day was the tractor, the gun tractor for the G5. And some of the engineers, they had an attitude of there is no space anywhere left on the gun tractor for personal equipment as well as water for the crew. Everything on that truck had to be used for ammunition and other ancillary equipment. So I said to them, no, for me as a representative of the end user, not available, not acceptable. So I insisted on providing a lockable locker per crew member, and also enough water tanks. And they went back and they redesigned, and eventually we got that from them. And everybody then was happy. Okay, then about maintenance. Maintenance and repair, we enjoyed maintenance and repair environments at more or less all levels, which was very, very important to us. So also the existence of illustrated part catalogs, that was very valuable. Then a funny one, the end user, us, had never been informed about prohibitions laid down by the South African Air Force regarding the safe air transport of certain items in use by the Army, which resulted in at least one incident I am aware of that posed a problem we had to resolve very urgently, involving inter alia a visit by road to the Windhoek branch of African Oxygen. What went wrong on that day is gas cylinders filled with hydrogen gas to be used on the front by us to inflate met balloons. These gas cylinders arrived at Grootfontein, but when we collected them, we discovered that the Air Force have let out the hydrogen gas. And then we were told the Air Force, they would never fly filled hydrogen gas cylinders. So that's why we had to make a plan to get somebody at African Oxygen in Windhoek to supply us with refilled hydrogen bottles. Lesson learned. Then another thing that happened in that time during Operation Protea, we went over the border at about 11 o'clock that night, and I was in my command vehicle, and somewhere at the back there were a convoy of ammunition trucks. And we just started to move when I received a radio message that one of the trucks loaded with 127mm rockets just struck a landmine. Now, fortunately, nobody was injured, and the truck itself afterwards could be repaired. But when after I've arranged now for what is to happen, the question in my mind was, what about the ammunition, which received a huge knock? Was the ammunition still safe to use? So in the heat of the moment, that time of the night, I made contact with Grootfontein, and I asked them to arrange for a ammunition expert from Pretoria as soon as possible to come and inspect those rockets. About 2 days went by, and then this guy arrived there, and to our satisfaction, he inspected every rocket and he declared them as safe. So eventually these rockets reached us and we could use them later on again. So the lesson here was, when you prepare for battle, make sure you've got ammunition experts at close hand, because it's difficult beforehand to expect or to know what might happen to ammunition, either our own or captured ammunition of the enemy. The next I would like to share with you is the importance of a detailed knowledge about the nature and the employment of the enemy's armament and his ammunition. Their mode of employment are the same, and the effects thereof, which had not been sufficiently attended to in our military training at home. Without going into detail, during Operation Savannah, I was on the receiving end of specific enemy ammunition, and I immediately said to myself, we have not been trained or taught about anything about this specific ammunition. So this then had been rectified afterwards, and yeah, very important. Then the prompt reporting of any of our own ammunition involved in accidents needed detailed investigation and appropriate action by inter alia our own ammunition experts as well as from the applicable ammunition manufacturers in our local armaments environment in order to prevent any repetition or repetitions. We also submitted praise and appreciation for the excellent quality of our locally produced ammunition. I believe that the quickest and the easiest way to destroy the morale of any army within 2 days is to issue them with inferior quality ammunition. That's exactly what happened to the Italians in the Second World War. Then, in future training and planning, more attention should also be given to the risks involved in the handling and transporting of captured enemy equipment and especially enemy ammunition. You know, people are always interested in fiddling around with captured equipment and captured ammunition, and it's a very dangerous thing. Yeah. Okay. Then something that is not generally known. Our armaments community did sterling work in receiving and repairing to a condition fit for immediate further operational equipment a number of 127mm Fishfanger multiple rocket launchers, which was employed by Perry in one of these operations. What happened was, due to the density, the thickness of the bush, these vehicles, these rocket launchers were heavily damaged. Just to give you an idea, when I saw them for the first time, they reminded me of something on its way to the scrapyard. Totally scrapped. But I made contact with Armscor and also Somkem down in the Cape. They were the manufacturers of these MRLs. Whether they think we could repair these wrecks. And they were flown down by Air Force to Somerset West, Somkem, and within days they were back as good as new. And we sent them up, and Perry received them, and his battery all of a sudden was completed again. Amazing. At some time, we had a putative shortage of 155mm ammunition, a serious shortage. It was brought to my attention, and in cooperation with Armscor, we had to make a decision, and to our good luck, a ship in the Cape Town Harbour with a full load of 155mm ammunition ready to sail to Iraq. Remember, we have sold a number of G5 guns to Iraq. So this ship was about to sail. And then I made the suggestion to the Armscor people, let us turn the ship around and take all that ammunition off. And it was accepted. What I can't tell you today is whether it was actually done, but my suggestion was accepted. In fact, I think it was done, because afterwards we never again in 1986, 1987 had to face a shortage of 155mm ammunition. Of course, also our own ammunition factories, 10 to 1, they also did some extra work. Then a funny one, gunner physical fitness. We are now talking about the people. We have done a lot of work in our corps. Everybody was not always happy about that, but to make our people physically tough, to get them fit. For the simple reason, artillery work is hard work. It is physically hard. I mean, in the course of a day or a night, any one member working on a gun could handle 2, 3, 4, 5 tons of ammunition. You know, really is really tough. So fitness of our people was always very, very important. Then something on the quality of our artillery leadership. We have been excellent in our contribution to the war. Excellent, absolutely excellent, as a result of many things. Good logistical support and other forms of support, but also due to the quality of leadership throughout all the ranks. And the type of leadership that I'm referring to here, I call it tough-minded leadership, which simply means one has to be physically, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, and intellectually fit. In Afrikaans, ons praat van veerkragtige leierskap. To challenge what I am fond of calling a state of mind that you will find in any big organization, and that is what I call intellectual constipation, which at times were quite rife in the army. So, yeah, tough-mindedness is the opposite of intellectual constipation. Then I became highly perturbed and very critical about the way in which the South African Defence Force conducted itself during the consecutive operations Modular, Hooper, Packer, Prone, and possibly Hilti at the operational and the strategic levels of campaigning and planning, which at times bordered on panic in certain higher headquarters in Pretoria, and even at governmental levels, which I will not cover in this presentation since my brief is to focus on issues pertaining to artillery logistics. Save to proudly state that the superior performance of our artillery miraculously and proudly saved the day, as implied by what the then Chief of the Defence Force, General Geldenhuys, in a publication by him after the war titled How the Soviets and Cubans Lost the War in Southern Africa, pertaining to artillery logistics in a set period of successive operations, the following. I've mentioned emergency repairs of Bundu-based MRLs, the shortage of, or a looming shortage of 155mm ammunition. And then we also experienced, in that time, 2 155mm G5 barrel prematures. And then another very interesting one. At one stage, in one of our 127mm MRL batteries, 2 rockets in one or other spontaneous manner decided they are going to launch themselves. While the vehicle was traveling, the driver on the one seat and the co-driver on the other seat. And miraculously, and nobody can explain that, both these rockets went through the cabin between these two guys. You can imagine, with all those flames, etc., through the windscreen and gone into the bushes. Unbelievable. And those two guys got out of that without a scratch. Of course, with eyes that big. Okay, the last thing I would like to mention here is eventually the Visvanger MRL was replaced by the 42 10-ton SAML-based Battalier, which is more sturdy in the bush. You know, they get a bigger firepower, 40 tubes instead of 24. Sorry, I've used the wrong term. It's not Visvanger, but Visarend. The smaller MRL with which we initially started off. Then, in conclusion, Napoleon Bonaparte, he was a gunner. And through the ages until today, considered to be the best general that ever walked on this earth. But as a gunner, he made quite a number of statements. One of them is, and I quote, "It is with artillery that war is made." Now, infanteers and the other corps, they don't like that one. He also said, "God fights on the side with the best artillery." And then this one, "Crack the head of the one who supplies the wrong artillery ammunition." Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. That was wonderful, General. General, I've been told that at some stage the Cubans were very, very worried that the G5 gun can actually fire a tactical nuclear shell. Is that possible even in theory?
Very good question. You're not the first one to ask me that question. The 155 millimeter caliber does make it suitable for launching a nuclear projectile. It was demonstrated very successfully by the Americans in as early as 1954 in the New Mexico desert somewhere. So yes, it is possible. Smaller calibers, probably not possible, but from 155 millimeter upwards, yes, it is possible.
But just to be sure, so it's not that we actually had tactical nuclear weapons there with us.
Just to rephrase your question.
Did we have any tactical nuclear shells or bombs with us in Angola?
No, my answer is no. Not that I know of. In fact, I'm of the opinion that we have not even manufactured such weapon. What we did manufacture, and that is common knowledge, was the deliverance of 155 nuclear bombs by aircraft. If I've got my figures correct, I think 7 of those bombs were manufactured, and eventually, around about 1994, shortly after that, they were destroyed.
Yeah, that's right. So I think we're the only country in the world who ever gave up our nuclear weapons for free.
Yes.
The problem is that the nuclear scientists afterwards said they can still manufacture them. It was quite a big story. Which brings me to this Gerald Bull. I understand that he was warned by several people that he's heading for trouble building this strange railway gun office to Saddam Hussein. But there are also people who says that because of Gerald Bull, this is actually more a Canadian design, the G5, than it is a South African design. How would you respond to that statement?
It's an interesting issue. I will be the last person to believe that Bull actually designed the G5. I think his main input was the technical know-how of producing fairly long length barrels. The G5 came into service with a 45 caliber barrel, meaning 45 times 155 millimeter. That's the length of the barrel. Bull demonstrated probably that even a 52 caliber 155 millimeter gun was probably what we were looking at. So as far what I understand is he transferred knowledge to us, but not a product. In one way or the other, I think he arranged if I've got my figures correctly, for us to make use of 4, we dubbed them G3 guns. The well-known old American long tom, 155 millimeter long tom. So we had a couple of them here, but not for our training use or for employing in operations, but for the testing of ammunition. What happened to them after those tests were conducted and testing was finalized, I haven't got a clue. I've not seen them ever again. Maybe they've been sold to another country who were interested in them. But yes, we had them here for a year or 18 months or so for the purposes of ammunition testing.
I have a question for you about the barrels of the G5. I've been to Singapore, and there you can see the 16-inch guns they have there to defend the port during World War II.
Yeah, so sort of a naval gunnery.
Yes.
In a naval gunnery environment, yeah.
Yes, and it came out that they explained to me is that these barrels, whenever they had to be repainted or serviced or whatever they do, they would take it away, service it, and then put it in wherever. If there's a battleship who needs this barrel, then they would put it in that barrel. I think it might have been 15-inch as well. So they were not assigned to a battery as such. They would service whoever has a need.
Yeah, so sort of kept in reserve, sort of a strategic reserve.
Yes, and then when that battleship barrel is now completely redone, they would take it to Singapore. So they would switch the barrels around. Is that the same with a G5, or you issued a barrel to a gun like you would be with your rifle? It has one barrel, it's attached to it, and that's it. You can't switch it around.
You can. What is very interesting is, up until now, our G5s are the only 155 millimeter guns in the world, allowing you or making it possible for you to exchange barrels in the field. At one stage in my career, I happened to be the commander of 7 Division, and we had a couple of large divisional size exercises at Lohatla. And in all of those exercises, as part of the exercising everybody, I arranged for G5 barrels to be exchanged at night at Lohatla. And our technical service people, they did it in the nick of time. But only about 5 months ago, somebody in the armaments environment said to me, we are the only country with a 155 millimeter gun that can be replaced, with the barrel can be replaced in the field. In many of the other Western countries, apparently it could take up to 48 hours for that gun to go back to the factory. And only there could they change the barrel. So yeah, to come back to your question, the barrels are interchangeable. Of course, when it comes to the accuracy of firing, one will have to make sure you know what the current muzzle velocity of each barrel would be at that point in time, and to make provision for that in your ballistic calculations.
You said to me that SAF mislaid your hydrogen gas in the bottles and you had to refill it. May I ask, what do you do with hydrogen gas on a G5?
Okay, it's a very good question, but the gas was not meant for the G5. It was meant for inflating our med balloons.
Fire protection.
Yeah. So we had a med officer with us with his equipment, to send up met balloons to determine the speed of the wind and the rate of ascent of the balloon, etc., etc. All that was part of data that went into our accuracy computations. So yeah, no harm envisaged with the hydrogen gas into a G5.
Yeah, but you know, sir, I was a sergeant in the police, and I know constables, and I'm sure that you as an officer know troops. What is the chances that they use that gas to make their beer cold? Is that possible? Would such a thing happen? Because I'm sure if you spray a beer bottle with that gas, it's gonna get like a ice around it or something. Instantly cooler box.
Spraying the beer bottle or the can with which gas?
With hydrogen gas, sir. What would happen if you do that? If you had a beer there and the beer is warm and you spray it with this gas, will it cool it down?
I've not heard that before. Anything is possible, but I can't imagine that they could have had access to these bottles. You know, the Met officer, which was a rare phenomenon to have, he really looked after his bottles like a hen would look after chickens. But yeah, I don't know. I get it. Perry, you heard about that?
The hydrogen will explode when it gets in contact with the air. So they would rather use a fire extinguisher to cool off their beers.
That sounds more probable. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's good. I'm glad that the colonel knows about this.
I haven't done it. Apparently they've done it.
Ja, na bewering, Terry, na bewering.
Yeah.
If any one of you out here actually know about this and you've tried it, please come and tell us. I mean, I'm sure the general will forgive you after 50 years if you apologize. So why are we calling you Golf 9? Golf 9?
Golf, the J stands for guns. And the 9, traditionally, that's something we inherited from the English. In our signals environment, 9 indicates the commander. So the infantry commander would be India 9, Golf 9.
Tango 9.
Tango 9 for the tanker, the armor guy.
Colonel, I've heard something. One of the special forces people told me that I think it was at Kyoto Carnival, that these rocket launchers of yours actually got those ring things around them, and then they make a more dreadful sound than normal. And even showed me a video of that. Is there a change in sound when you add those rings to slow them down to shoot shorter?
Yeah, there's a significant sound, especially when you have launched them. They have this like a whistle, but a very eerie sound that it makes. And I think for those people on the shelf, and that's why the Portuguese soldiers at 32 Battalion called the MRLs the Xandungus, because it is when they when they arrive, they cause a lot of heat because of the resin in which the ball bearings have been placed, etc., etc. So it was called by the Portuguese soldiers of 32 Battalion as the Xandungus. But if I may, there's one logistic-related aspect, and I think hopefully the general will forgive me because he may not be aware of this. But it has a logistics implication. In 1 year at the 4 Art Regiment, I think I was the 2IC at 4 Art Regiment, and we received a charge allocation of charge 3 for the G5s. And because of the very small range at Potchefstroom, you sit with a ricochet a problem if you fire on high charges in a small range. So I decided that let's create some range by liaising with farmers at the Klerksdorp, Stilfontein environment, and we did have a willing farmer to say you can deploy it, but please just remove your bully beef tins and things. I don't want that stuff to be in my field. So we had that deployment, but then civil aviation said on one condition can you fire from outside the range into the range is that you need to have radar coverage. Because otherwise the aircraft, it will be unsafe for civilian aircraft. So we arranged with an old friend of mine, Carl Lindsay, who was at that stage in the air defense artillery, still at Eysterplaat or Youngsfield at that stage. And he committed himself by sending up a Tupperware radar so that we can deploy it close to the range between the blunt end and sharp end. So we deployed road patrols to block off the road. We had the radar in place. Civil aviation was happy about our arrangements. And then the air defense radar people reported that the radar is not working. So I said, just for in case anybody is observing this deployment, manually turn that radar around so that whoever is observing can see, but the radar is working, although we knew it wasn't working. Okay. Then we engage the target. We start with adjusting fire or the initial process. But what was difficult for us, which we only found out later, is that there were two fire different map. The old one and a new one. The old one was still in feet, and the new one was in meters. So we adjust fire by the fire control post. We used the meter. But then when we start with fire for effect, luckily I ordered a battery right 60, meaning each gun will fire separately with a 60-second interval. But the first troop that was to fire was the one that used the old map. But what happened in the fire control post, they read in the height, the value was in feet. But the computer seen that value of 5,210 feet, see it as meters. So when the first round came, I heard the sound, but it was a bit higher, and I was going through my observation zones, and my observation zones went across the Ventersdorp Road, and by the time I heard the second shot, I saw that far away from me, I saw a dust cloud, and then I realized there's a round for which I don't have a range clearance. So what happened is that all the calculations were correct, but when that round arrived at its point, there was no ground underneath because it was still too high. So it just carried across the Ventersdorp Road, and then we dispatched Colonel Duff and Cassie van der Merwe to go and investigate, because then at that stage I was quite afraid of the potential damage that could have been caused. But luckily the farmer who was milking cows at that stage, he said he heard a very strange and ugly noise. But that for me was a valid lesson of making sure that you have a universal referencing system. Otherwise, you may have these hiccups. But that was an invention in logistics-wise, where we couldn't get a charge 2 allocation, and then we made some innovations, but some of them backfired. But it was a good lesson. Thank you.
May I also ask you before you go, sir, is it possible to use your barrage against the armor?
Say again. Just say again. The
Can you
artillery
use-
strike on the armor.
Yes.
Yeah, well, it is also, I think, a good question that even our rocket launchers, the MRLs, actually destroyed quite a number of T-54 tanks. not because of the penetration capability, but of the fire hazard, because whilst the tanks are boonder bashing through the bushes, all the dry leaves and branches are falling at the back of the tank. The tank, and normally the T-54s had an extra drum, 44-gallon drum at the back. So all the branches and leaves are collecting there at the back. So when this rocket explode above it with the resin, burning resin falling onto the tank, the actually tank starts to fire, and that causes the destruction of the tank. So whenever you have armored vehicles or with external fuel tanks, then they become vulnerable.
I want to add on to what he has just shared with you about the range and everything that actually went wrong. Don't worry about that. I was the commander of the School of Artillery, and I was also looking for a possibility in that area of shooting at the maximum range of the G5, about 35 kilos. But as Pierre has indicated, our shooting range was far too small. So I decided to go to the mining, one of the mines in the Stilfontein, to go to the mining community, talk there to the bosses and get their permission to deploy a G5 at the mine. And I went to the Air Force to get clarity or clearance with commercial
civil aviation.
Yeah, you know, the commercial aircraft business. So they obtained that okay, and we went to Stilfontein, deployed the gun there, and we fired a couple of rounds on maximum charge right into the center of the range that Pierre used. So welcome, you're in good company, man. Then what you will find very interesting, in the world of artillery, there's a phenomenon called muzzle flash. When a gun fires, that flash, and at night it illuminates the area, and you know the enemy could pick that up and get an idea of where your guns are deployed. So many nations in this world for many years, many decades, have struggled with this problem, but still there is no simple solution to that. So in our time, I contacted people at Somchem down in Cape Town. They were the producers of our
rockets.
Not the fillings, the rocket fillings,
Yeah.
the charges. And I make them make this problem visible to them, and I ask them to please look what can be done. And some water went over the, what do we say, over the rocks, under the bridge for a month or three. And one evening, a certain guy called Pretorius, he called me, but I could hear in his voice he was very excited. And he said to me, they've got a solution to this. And I was invited to, at their cost, you know, be treated as a VIP. They flew me down to Cape Town. I reported to Somchem about 4 o'clock that afternoon. And I could see the excitement on everybody's face. They've got something they're going to share with me. And it became darker, and all of a sudden there was a very nice supper. And after supper, it was really dark. They selected that night, a dark night. Now they are going to show me something, but still very secretive. So in a vehicle, and I haven't got an idea where they took me that night because I'm not familiar with that area, and it was dark. think they took me to a place called Roy Elf. There we stopped. We got out of the vehicle. I looked around, couldn't see anything. It's pitch black, dark. And they said to me, look in that direction. You're going to see something. I looked, still I saw nothing. And then all of a sudden, as if somebody has struck a match, very small flame. And the next moment, then I saw that there was a gun, a G5, firing as I was looking like that. They were firing from right to left into what I never knew. They had a sort of a tunnel there in the mountain that they used for ammunition testing. And they said to me, see what we have achieved. A small flame. I was flabbergasted. I was heavily impressed. I thought, oh, South Africans, SOCAM have now solved this ages-old problem. And then I said to them, okay, take me to the gun. Show me what you've done. To my surprise, when we got to the gun, okay, then they switched on the electric light and you could see a set of, you know what do you use in your garden? These, sprinklers. Yeah. The gun was decorated in sprinklers with a tank at the back and one other little engine that produced force. So what they did is 1 or 2 seconds before the gun was fired, they applied the force. They opened the tap, and at the front end of the barrel there was a fine spray, and that spray killed the real McCoy, not what they demonstrated, the real McCoy. And they told me the Dutch people, they struggled with this problem more than 100 years ago, and they found this solution. And somebody dug this up out of one or other history book. But of course, very, it's very complicated, you know, to put these little tubes and the canister with the water and everything to attach that to a gun under operating conditions. So yeah, I was very impressed with the idea, but it was a no-go idea.
That's fascinating.
That problem still exists today. In fact, after we have decimated our enemy on the night of the 9th and the 10th of August 86, I got some message from one other source which pointed to the fact that some enemy observer, he could see that night where we fired from at a distance of 65 kilometers. He was sitting 65 kilometers from where we fired. Well, you could do nothing about that, but it was important to me. They could see the flare-ups. So that problem has not been solved yet. Thank you.
So does that mean, sir, that you would shoot and leave? Because if you stand still and you stay there, surely...
that's the old story of Wood and Scoot.
Importance of reducing the flash at the blunt end is what we normally do as an observer is that when you see a flash, you start counting in seconds, and then you get a compass bearing, so you get a rough idea of a distance and a direction from where this launcher has fired. So if you reverse the process, you will understand that reducing the flash at the blunt end is critical, because it is part of your survival.
General, I've seen quite a few funerals in my life of military officers, senior men, and they're all being buried, and the coffin would be on a gun carriage. Why is that? Where does that come from?
it is an old English tradition. That's where it came from. But for one other reason, in the last couple of years, it never happened again. I don't know, maybe due to this new government, they don't like us to do that. But on the other hand, I think if one would request today to do it, you might probably get a positive answer. It's a pity. Nevertheless, or despite the fact that it was imported from the British, you know, they are big on pomp and ceremony. But yeah, this was a very gracious and a solemn way of being taken to your last resting position. Because one could also what's the word now, trap or cover that the gun and the coffin with all types of, you know, accoutrements, just to make the whole thing more solemn, you know, colors, flags, etc., etc., etc. I can't remember when last I have seen it. Perry, can you remember?
I think with Nelson Mandela's funeral, they used that. I think they still use it for senior people.
Yeah, and then in front of the cortege, they called it a cortege, a French word. There was about 2 sections of foot soldiers marching, very slow march, and then a band at the back also playing very solemn music. So it was quite, hoe shall I say, heart-rendering, you know.
Well, Internet, we've come to the end of this one, and fascinating indeed. As I said to you, there's going to be a third episode where we're going to talk about the rocket launchers, and I think that's going to be very fascinating as well. Gentlemen, General, Colonel, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time here, and God bless until we meet again.
Thank you, Koos. We appreciate what you are doing to spread
The gospel.
Information about our artillery. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Koos.
The Ditsong National Museum of Military History was established during the Second World War, largely as a result of the fact that South Africa had made no attempt during the First World War to record its activities in that war. So, fortunately, when General Smuts became Prime Minister in 1939 and South Africa declared war, he made sure that our involvement in the Second World War would be recorded for posterity and for future generations. The result of that was the start of what was then known as the South African National War Museum. The museum was opened on these premises in August 1947, and at the time of the opening, Smuts said that the museum would serve as a memorial to what was then known as the greatest united effort our country had produced, which was the involvement in the Second World War. He also said that the museum would serve as a warning for future generations that the weapons that they see here must never be used again. Unfortunately, as we all know, that warning has not been heeded. In the early 1970s, the museum became known as the South African National Museum of Military History, and the scope was shifted to the preservation and recording of the entire history of South Africa. So not just the First and Second World Wars, but all wars, all conflicts where South Africans had been involved. In the late 1990s, under the new dispensation, all the national museums were amalgamated, and the 3 national museums in the Gauteng province, this museum and the National Cultural History Museum and the Transvaal Museum, were amalgamated together to form what was then became known as Ditsong Museums of South Africa. And this museum has from then been known as the Ditsong National Museum of Military History, and that is our official name today. We preserve, as has been said, all aspects of South Africa's military history, and the exhibits that you see here at the museum are not here to glorify war. The exhibits are here to show what can be done if necessary, and show that war is a sad thing. People die in warfare. We like to educate people that war is not a good thing at all. But we do acknowledge that people went and served their country. In many cases, they volunteered to do this, and many people paid the supreme sacrifice for their country. And we acknowledge that as well. And as such, the museum is also, we consider it home to all military veterans who have served their country. And many veterans associations, such as the MOTS, the Memorable Order of Tin Hats, the South African Legion of Military Veterans, and other associations such as the Gunners Association, the SAF Association, and the South African Armour Association also hold their respective commemorations here at the museum as well. The museum is open 7 days a week. The only 2 days that the museum is not open is Good Friday and Christmas Day. Our opening times are from 9 till 4:30 every day, Monday to Sunday. The entrance fee is 50 Rand. Subject to change, that's a minimum fee. There are other fees for scholars and for senior citizens. The facilities that we offer here at the museum is basically for everybody, not just for military enthusiasts. We do have a conference center here. We do allow for events to take place, such as conferences, meetings, events. You could have cocktail parties here. We've had many in the past. We also welcome children's birthday parties. They seem to be very popular here. And people are welcome to come with a picnic basket and sit on the lawn and, just take in the atmosphere, the garden, the tranquil surrounds that we have here at the museum. One of our facilities we have here is free parking. We do not charge for parking. The parking is secure as well. We do have full-time security plus security cameras. The museum falls under Ditsong Museums of South Africa has been spoken about. The Ditsong then falls under the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture. Being a government department, funding is not entirely adequate. We do need further donations and support. We do have a building and development trust run by veterans and people who support the museum, and they raise funds to assist various programs that the museum has. We are always looking for volunteers in this regard. Every quarter we have what we call maintenance days at the museum, where people come and help clean the exhibits and do maintenance around the museum. That seems to be very popular with the crowd. We also require support with certain technological aspects, such as maintenance of exhibits, there are times where we don't have the technical capacity to carry out such maintenance. So voluntary support is always welcome here at the museum. We rely as well on donations. They can either be monetary, which would go towards the upkeep of this museum, as well as exhibits. And we look at exhibits that maybe have someone that was very important, medals or uniforms or what have you, or even other things such as badges, photographs, even documentation such as diaries, letters that go into our archives. We do have a library here, one of the most substantial military history libraries in the Southern Hemisphere. It is open during weekdays. During opening hours here at the museum, people are welcome to visit the library or make an appointment to do research in our library as well. As the director of this fine establishment, we welcome everybody here to this museum. I look forward to seeing more and more people coming to learn about our military history and using our facilities. People are always very welcome here.
Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and ring the bell to receive notifications.
Edited by Fossey. If you'd like to see what he gets up to in his spare time, do please visit his own little YouTube channel, Fossey at Treasure and Treats. Links included below. Your support would be highly appreciated. Help me grow my little channel. Thank you. Dankie. Inkos Kakulu. Bye.